Okay, chapter 11, day 3 video. How do we graph some different graphs like tangent and the reciprocal trig functions like secant and cosecant and cotangent. We save these for a different day because they're kind of unique. First one is we're going to look at how do we graph y equals tangent x. All right. Well, in order to graph tangent, you have to realize that tangent is undefined at 90 degrees and 270, or pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. And since it's undefined there's going to be what we call an asymptote, and we talked about that before. It'll be close, but never touch that value. Okay? And so tangent will get close to that value, but never touch it. All right? So at 0 degrees, tangent is sine over cos. Sine is 0, cos is 1, so it starts out here right at 0. So their tangent will start right there on the center line. Okay? Now, as the angle gets closer to 90, sine gets bigger, okay? And sine and cosine gets smaller. But when you divide by a smaller number, the whole fraction gets bigger. And so tangent would head up like this, but never touch this dotted line, okay? Once we get beyond 90, it's the same process, but now since x is negative, it starts out down here, crosses at 180 and heads back up again. Because at 180, cosine has a value of -1, sine has a value of 0, so again, tangent has a value of 0. Now in the third quadrant, they're both negative, so now we get negative divided by negative is positive again, so it looks like quadrant 1. And it repeats itself to 360. And that's the tangent graph. Okay? Negative tan is just the flip. Where everything's positive, it's negative, and where it's negative, it's positive. So it's just a mirror image of the previous thing I just drew. Cosecant. Okay? So let's think about what this says. Cosecant. Since cosecant is 1 over sine, there are asymptotes when sine is equal to 0. In other words, 0, 180, and 360. Because you can't divide by 0. So what do we first do? If I'm going to graph cosecant, I'm going to first graph sine x. We just got done doing this. So it's just a basic sine x graph. Sine starts at center line, maximum at 1, 0, minimum, back to 360. And since there's asymptotes when sine is equal to 0, we have asymptotes at the 0 degree line, we have asymptotes at the 180, and asymptotes at the 360. In other words, you can't touch it. Well, so what's really neat, because of this, the reciprocal, is the cosecant graph then comes in, touches, because 1 divided by 1 is 1, and then back up again. And it looks like that. And then it follows the same pattern down here. And so this piece and this piece, these are the cosecant graph. This is. And this is. It's part of it. It takes on two sections. Looks like ribbon candy when you get it Christmas time. Okay, so let's look at the secant graph. Since secant is the flip of the cos, there are asymptotes when the cosine value is equal to 0. Okay, so the same thing. At 90 and 270 are places where cosine, just look where the graph hits the 0 line, you're going to have an asymptote. Where the graph hits the 0 line, you're going to have an asymptote. So what do? You draw a cosine first. And it follows the same thing that the other graph did. So it's going to start here and head up. Okay, because if this graph kept going, this would keep going. All right. Down here, comes up, touches at -1 and back down again. Because 1 over -1 is -1. That's the most it can be. Otherwise, 1 over a decimal is actually a bigger negative number. And then up here, same thing. It will it back up again. But it will never touch this line. And that is the secant graph. So it's just a matter of drawing your original trig function and touching on the maxes and mins. But put your asymptotes in. Whenever your graph, whether it's sine or cos, hits the 0 line, you put an asymptote in. Put an asymptote in. Notice. Where it hits the 0 line, there's an asymptote. Hits the 0 line, there's an asymptote. The graph is trapped in between these asymptotes. Last one is cotangent, which is kind of a pain in the neck because it's a big mess. But you first draw tangent, and this right here is the asymptote for tangent. Okay, you first have to have tangent in there. Now, when tangent is equal to 0, is where you're going to have asymptotes for cotangent. So where tangent hits the 0, I'm going to draw this new asymptote line. Okay, where tangent hits 0, here's a new asymptote line, and right here. Okay, so now cotangent just does the same stuff, but in the other direction. All right, so let's go with, all right. So cotangent will follow like the tangent pattern, but just in this other direction. Okay. And there's your cotangent graph. That's it. Just graphing some weird graphs today. Most of the time these occur in multiple choice where you just have to pick out which graph it is. All right. That's it.